Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Today, Lisa and I will be going over the recommendations that were provided to us by the Florida Bar, the task force that was created 2 days after the tragedy that occurred at Champlain and Surfside. I'm going to give everyone about a minute to log in. I know we've had a significant amount of board members and managers that have signed up for the webinar. So before we get started, we wanted to give everyone an opportunity to check in. We will be doing Q&A. So at the bottom or type of your screen, you will see the Q&A function. Feel free to add any questions there, and Lisa and myself will do our best to get to them. The task force report was pretty extensive. There were close to about 13 recommendations that were provided. In today's webinar, we're going to be going over 2, maybe 3, because again, there's so much, it's so dense and so much to it that we wanted to make sure that we focused, at least are the ones that are going to impact the associations. And so we're going to be going over those. I think we're pretty steady on the numbers, Lisa. So if you don't mind giving us a little bit of an introduction and say a little bit about yourself as well as the firm you work for.
Well, thank you so much, Raphael. My name is Lisa McGill. I'm an attorney here at K. Bender Rembaum with over 25 years of experience with community associations. I serve on the CAI Federal Legislative Action Committees and also on the Government and Public Affairs Committee. So in connection with that service, I was tasked to be a part of one of the CAI task forces that were created in response or after the tragic and devastating impact of the Champlain Towers collapse in Surfside, Florida. My firm has been in existence for in excess of 20 years, and we have offices throughout Florida, primarily Broward County, Palm Beach County, and Hillsborough County. So we also provide a lot of educational seminars. So I'm happy to participate today with you on these important topics, because I know that you have a focus a lot on educating the general public about community association issues.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And it's always a pleasure and an honor to be alongside you here on these webinars. I do appreciate everything that you do for our industry as well as for our community. As for myself, my name is Raphael Aquino. I am the CEO and co-founder of Affinity Management Services. We are a community association management company. We're more of a boutique operation for those associations that are looking for really that personal service. We have offices in Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach County now. So we've been growing extensively in Palm Beach, and we're very excited about that. As Lisa mentioned, we do like to do our part in really educating the community of what's going on, what's impacting our associations, what we could do as a unit or as a group to continue to improve our profession, and also inform the board members and managers that we work for and serve or that are within our community. So as Lisa mentioned, today we'll be going over the task force, the Florida Task Force report that was provided. The task force was basically comprised of 2 days after the tragedy that occurred at Champlain Tower. It was comprised by the leadership of the Condominium and Plan Development Committee of the Real Property Probate and Trust Law, also known as RPPTL. So if you'd like to get a copy of the report, if you don't have one, please feel free to email either Lisa's team or my team, and we'll be happy to provide that to you. An email will go out after the webinar that we'll be posting the video live on our YouTube channel, and we'll share that with you, and I'll make sure that my team shares the report for the task force. So as I stated earlier, there were 13 recommendations. In my opinion, I think the task force, really got together and thought things through. There are some things that, we take a different position. However, in today's webinar, we're going to talk on 2 major topics, 2 recommendations, and we're going to go off the recommendation number within the report. We're going to touch up on recommendation 1 and also recommendation 2. So the first recommendation that was provided, it's called the Board of Directors Obligation for Maintenance, Repair, and Replacement. Within the recommendation, once you guys review it, you'll notice that there's their general findings, what the current law does and provides, and any relevant considerations, and then also they provided their recommendation. So when it comes to the Board of Directors maintenance for obligations, they recommending changing the law to require timely maintenance of structural and life safety systems in vertical construction, specifically mentioning like the list of components in the developer turnover report. Plus, they wanted to add the waterproofing. So, Lisa, I wanted to ask you, when it came to that recommendation of the timely maintenance, what are your thoughts on that? And what are your thoughts on the recommendation that the task force provided?
Well, everyone knows that the association bears responsibility for the maintenance, care, and protection of the common elements of the condominium, right? It doesn't specifically say the board has the obligation to perform maintenance in those exact words. Obviously, Section 718, 113 says the maintenance of the common elements is a responsibility of the association. Other portions of the statute require the officers and directors to have a fiduciary relationship to the unit owners, and other areas of the statute require the directors to act in good faith according to their fiduciary duties, which would be in good faith with the care of a reasonable person and in a manner best believed to be in the interest of the association. By requiring timely maintenance, the word timely, in my opinion, is a little bit vague. We have to remember, these are recommendations that are going now to be vetted by our elected representatives in Tallahassee. So these need to be not only vetted and examined and evaluated, but there are no legislative proposals that are based specifically against these recommendations. It's a little bit premature for us to talk about specific legal changes that may result as a result of the recommendations, but there are some items of which I think community associations need to be aware, including that the recommendation for inspection reports to be made public. That goes without saying, but for the community association leader, board members to follow all the protocols that are laid out either in a developer maintenance manual, if of course the laws change to require a developer maintenance manual, and to give the association some leeway when it comes to maintenance and repair so that they're not responsible for incidental damages that are caused in connection with the repair, not responsible for dislocation or offsite living expenses if that becomes necessary for the repair. Those are all good things for our community associations. Really, the mantra here, or the feeling is that yes, boards are responsible for maintenance of common elements, but what does that mean? What does timely maintenance of the common elements mean? And I really think a lot of the recommendations go towards that, answering that question.
Okay, excellent. And when we were discussing offline prior to the webinar, you brought up an excellent point. What happens if they do pass it where they require a certain kind of maintenance that needs to be done to each equipment? Can that put the association in some kind of liability when it comes to the developer construction, a 558 claim? Can you touch up a little bit on that?
Again, right now, we're operating a little bit of in a vacuum, but yes, I do see where if there is a maintenance manual and the maintenance manual has not been updated, the association is going to be responsible for compliance with the maintenance manual. So that means that a failure to perform all the tasks set forth in the maintenance manual may give rise to liability. Not only liability from your owners, any of your owners say, hey, the board's not doing its job because it didn't follow guideline 3A on page 37 with respect to the HVAC system. And also I can foresee that if these maintenance manuals are prepared by developers initially, that there could be opportunity for developers to claim they're not responsible for any problems associated with new construction due to a failure to adhere with all your I's dotted and all your T's crossed to every single recommendation or guideline in the maintenance manual. So think about your car. I mean, you have a car, you get a book when you buy it, and it says that every 5,000 miles you do this, 10,000 this, 30,000 that. You follow it for the most part, but you haven't committed that book to memory, and you haven't really committed to making every single repair or maintenance task that's on there. So obviously, we want community leaders to have the information that they need in order to properly maintain or treat these buildings like you would as a commercial entity would treat buildings, with the care and the confidence that people need to know that their properties are safe. But again, we don't want to bootstrap our directors or our community association managers into situations where they may face increased scrutiny.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, that was a good point that we were discussing. And I and I do want everyone to keep in mind, Lisa's mentioned it a couple of times. These are just recommendations. They haven't passed yet. We just wanted to, again, inform the community of what's going on. That way, if you have any kind of positions, you could reach out if necessary, but of what could be coming. I also agree with what you mentioned. It would be great to be able to have a manual. Now, we all know what can happen if they start forcing, putting it very detailed. It can be very challenging, but it would be much easier for management as well as for the board to understand with each component within the building of what needs to get done. Now, as you stated, timely is kind of vague. We don't know what that means, but hopefully there'll be a little bit more clarity when that comes out. I do have a question here from Nancy. Are there any mandates for 2020 that result in budget increases? So Nancy, we're going to touch up on that. But again, remember, these are recommendations. Nothing has come out just yet that's going to put the mandate onto the associations as of now. These are just recommendations that have been provided. So the next recommendation that we're going to go over is recommendation number 5 that's within the task force report. And that recommendation has to do with reserve studies, reserve waivers, and funding of reserves. So this one's actually pretty dense. There's several points that are addressed within here. So we're going to break them down one by one. The first one that they place here, it's called their recommendation for reserve studies. So the recommendation that they're providing is basically the task force is recommending to amend the act to require periodic reserve studies for residential condominiums with 3 stories or greater. There are some challenges that both Lisa and I see on this recommendation. And let's start with the one that I just read, which is 3 stories or greater. What's your opinion, Lisa, on that? Do you believe that it should be 3 stories, or do you think that that should be eliminated?
Personally, I feel that every community association that has any significant common improvements or improvements for which the association bears responsibility should have a reserve study. It's an important budgeting tool for you as directors. It's an important disclosure tool for you as directors, you as management, for all of your owners. All of your owners, your existing owners, need to know what their expectations are with respect to major building repairs and maintenance, and what their financial obligation will be in connection with those future activities. The same is true for prospective buyers. So having that reserve study, it's not a panacea, but it does give you a listing of all the components. It gives you an estimated remaining useful life of those components and the estimated cost of either replacing or substantial repair of those components. And that's the real cost of ownership. The real cost of ownership is not your $568 that you have to pay per month for your ongoing maintenance. The real cost of ownership includes the wear and tear on the building and paying for that depreciation. But a reserve study is not. It's not an engineering report. I believe, in my opinion, personally, the recommendations of the Florida Bar kind of conflate the engineering report with the reserve study. Reserve study is not an architectural review. It's not a pest control inspection. It's not a home inspection report. It's really a document that outlines all of the existing components that have a remaining useful life, gives you a lifetime or gives you some estimated remaining time for those components to be repaired or replaced, and serves as an important budgeting tool. The reserve study there's 2 components. There's the physical component list with the estimated remaining useful life. There's also the funding plan. So funding for a reserve study can be accomplished in many different ways. You want to work with your reserve analyst to ensure that the study itself meets your community's existing needs.
Correct. No, you bring up an excellent point. I agree with you that a reserve study, I'm glad that they placed a reserve study. I was a little bit let down that the 3 stories, because we have so many garden style properties, just like we have a couple high rises. But the garden style properties, why would you 3 stories and below? They shouldn't be removed. So as an example, we just obtained a property, 700 units, but they have 16 buildings and they're 2 stories. They definitely need a reserve study. They have, basic elevators. They have components, AC components, many components within the common area. So, eliminating that requirement for anyone that's below 3 stories, in my opinion, is not a great recommendation there. I'm hopeful that they'll be able to see that, realize that there's many buildings within South Florida that should have that requirement as well. And part of also they delineated what a reserve specialist in its way, like they made a recommendation that the reserve should be done by someone with 10 years of experience. And it should be like a licensed contractor or an engineer. I know both you and I agree that, that needs to be separated. There are organizations that specialize in obtaining a reserve study that can give you the breakdown of what the costs are going to be, what the estimated useful life is. They've been doing it for years within our industry. There's several reputable companies. And I don't believe that that's something that should be done, that needs to be done, I would say, by an engineer or a licensed general contractor. I think someone that has a reserve specialist license or has that license, that has done that, maybe has that experience, then that should be, in my opinion, the recommendation. What are your thoughts, Lisa?
I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, there's an entire industry of reserve professionals. I mean, think about all of the different types of properties. Reserve studies are not only for community associations, hotels, commercial properties, airports, large governmental entities are going to have some type of similar analysis, and also use that analysis as a budgeting tool or funding, funding expectations. So the reserve analysts that I've worked with in connection with the most recent task force, some are engineers, but not all are engineers. They have the expertise that they need in order to prepare a reserve study. And when we talk about reserve studies, we don't really have a definition of that in Florida. Now, the Florida Bar's recommendation kind of lays out what they would like to see in the reserve study. There are also national reserve study standards and that are published by various industry groups. One industry group, of course, being Community Associations Institute. Right. But there's a very big differential in the cost of an engineering report and a reserve study report. So if you're conflating the two, are you requiring an engineering report, or are you just requiring an engineer to prepare a reserve study? That needs to be flushed out, I think, a little bit more.
Correct. And I do want to give a tip to the managers and the board members that are on. Again, this is just a recommendation, but either way, it looks we're heading in this direction when it comes to reserve studies. So if you haven't done one yet, I strongly urge you to do it in January through March, which is actually the reserve specialists' slowest season, because we've been in conversations with 2 or 3 of the organizations that we work very closely with. Because if the recommendation does pass, there's going to be an influx of calls to those organizations. And when supply and demand changes happen, prices normally go up. The same thing is happening right now with engineers and contractors. They're not necessarily pushing their price up, but they're sticking to their price because there's a huge demand for their services. So if you're a manager and you're a board member, if you haven't wrapped up your budget, definitely you should consider getting a proposal so that you can take care of this next year. Number one, it's good to know where you stand, where the components are, where the cost of these components are, so you could do what's right for your community.
That's a great point. I didn't even think about it, but the scarcity, knowing that something will or may be required creates that scarcity. So get your schedule in now so you can get on the books so that you have an appointment for that work to be done.
Correct. And that way you have ample time for the budgeting season next year. If something happens, you know what you need to do, because we're going to touch up on a couple things that are really going to impact our associations if they pass. So let's go into the next one. So the reserve components, the task force is basically recommending within the components that are added, that they add the waterproofing within those requirements, which I personally think that's a good recommendation. I know many times you don't see it. What are your thoughts on that, Lisa?
Well, let me go through all the components, because right now the statute does require for condos and co-ops for the reserve study to include any items, the cost of which is going to exceed $10,000. So here are the items that they're specifically pointing to that are included in the transition report, which is the roof, structure, fireproofing and fire protection systems, elevators, heating and cooling systems, plumbing, electrical systems, swimming pool and spa and equipment, seawalls, pavement and parking areas, drainage systems, painting, irrigation, and you said waterproofing. So most of these items, I would venture to say any of these items are likely to cost more than $10,000 for replacement or substantial repair. And yet, when I see reserve schedules that are attached to my client's request for annual meeting notice packages, I see that the same three components: roof paving, painting, roof paving, painting. I know you have parking structures out there. I know you have a seawall out there. I know you have elevators out there. So it's obvious that many of the reserve schedules, if they're not professionally prepared, omit many of the items that really contribute to the safety and the structural integrity of the property as a whole. So I definitely agree that reserve categories should be modified or more clearly explained so that people do understand the purpose of the reserve study, and for them to have the knowledge and the disclosure requirements.
Yeah.
Waterproofing is a little bit more of a difficult item to evaluate because, you know, it's subsurface. It's not readily observable, but it's definitely, as we can see, something that can fail, has a useful life, and needs to be considered before a failure occurs.
Correct. And it's so important. You know, these are the little things that, again, no fault of the board members because they don't know. They're in another profession. But waterproofing it's used in so many parts of a building. I mean, the eyelids that go over the balconies, there's waterproofing in the balconies, there's waterproofing on roofs, there's waterproofing. And many times what you find is people don't understand that that's what protects the concrete. That's what avoids the water from penetrating in through the concrete and causing that spalling or that rust the rust that causes the concrete to spall. So it's great that they added it. What I would like to see, at least, again, not maybe something for the task force, but from our local counties to add is, you know, many times the waterproofing that's required, there's no specifics requirement. Like an engineer will give a specification, okay, place this one. But sometimes you'll see they'll use a cheaper material, let's say a 5-year material, and then they apply that on the balcony, and then you put a 30-year product, let's say like a tile on top of that. Makes no sense. I mean, you're going to have to take that towel off within 5 to 6 years because the useful life of that waterproofing material is that. So hopefully there's some stricter code as well, especially since as of now, what we've heard, again, we haven't received the full detail report, but there was failure within the waterproofing of those planters. And you have so many condos, so many buildings with similar issues that if they don't understand what the recommendation is for maintenance, as well as the useful life of it, how are board members or managers going to know? So it's good that they added that to the recommendation.
I'll tell you, some cities or some building departments are becoming more definite in what they will require. Yeah. My brother owns a condo in Sunny Isles Beach. Sunny Isles Beach has specific products that they will approve for waterproofing surfaces. Excellent. And before you're permitted to actually install the tile, the waterproofing manufacturer has to evaluate the work that was done by the contractor selected by the homeowner, just to ensure that the warranty is effective. So there are some building departments are more concerned with this than others, but I like your suggestion where the individual condo association hires someone to prepare the specifications for balcony modifications made by homeowners, because that way they'll have a little bit of more of a comfort level as to the longevity of their painting and their exterior facade maintenance.
Correct. No, it goes clear to the fact of how important it is to really work with your industry experts when you're going through these kinds of situations, so that you know whatever you're doing, it's what's right for the longevity of the building. The next one that we have here is what they mentioned, the pool of reserve. So, excuse me, sorry about that. The task force is basically recommending eliminating the option of pool reserves for the mandatory items that they're requiring. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I personally I don't accede to that recommendation. On the CII task force, where we're working with over 600 participants, many of them engineers, many of them reserve specialists accredited by various agencies, many of them reserve analysts that perform in all different types of applications, that uh, uh, where pooling is very, very effective, and we've known it to be effective. Now, maybe we do want some more constraints upon the use of reserves. The issue being considered, or the complaint that was raised, was that, hey, we're collecting $1 million for all of these different things, concrete restoration, waterproofing, railing repair, elevators, and lo and behold, the board comes along and says, hey, everyone, don't you want a new lobby? Don't you want a new pool renovation? Don't you want this or that? And you can vote to take those funds out of the reserves and put them into operating for a different project altogether. Maybe there needs to be a little bit more control as far as that is concerned. And that's something that the Florida Bar Task Force does have a recommendation on. But I do think that pooling reserves is a lot more effective from a cost or a fiscal standpoint. It gives the association a little bit more flexibility. It changes the actual monthly or quarterly funding that's required. And it's something that we as a CII task force recommended to retain, the pooled reserve.
Yeah, I would agree with you there wholeheartedly. Changing it to a straight line. Number one, I get the understanding. I think what they're trying to do is avoid maybe board members using something for something else, for a non-mandatory item. So, I can appreciate that they're probably trying to protect those mandatory items. But what happens within associations, things always happen when they shouldn't happen. You may have that waterproofing failed 3 years rather than 5 years. And now if you're in a straight line, you're in a catch-22 where you don't have sufficient funds to be able to make the necessary repair. So if you had pooled reserves, you can easily grab from there and then do the repair that's necessary, move forward with the project that you need to protect the safety of the individuals within the condominium, and not put the board of directors and management in a tough position. Again, I appreciate where they were going with it, but I think once you're in the ground dealing with it on a day-to-day, things never happen the way we planned them to happen. So that'll put a little bit more restriction on both board members and managers alike, I believe. The next recommendation here that they have is the reserve disclosure. Basically, the task force recommends required specific disclosures to unit owners in financial statements as to any waivers or reductions of required reserve funding. What are your thoughts there, Lisa, when it comes to that?
More disclosure, the better. More disclosure, the better.
Yeah.
I mean, not only for your existing owners, but for your potential owners. And every single year, it's designed, the way the statute is written right now, it's designed to notify the owners what their funding would be for fully funded reserves, and what their funding would be if they chose to waive or if they chose to partially waive. I don't see those votes or those annual meeting packages include that reliable information, the reserve study saying, hey, listen, if you vote to waive right now, and you have the big letters and capital letters and bold, in bold font on the proxy question, but I don't see anything that says, hey, listen, if you vote to waive, that means in the next 2 years, you're going to have to pay a special assessment for the roof, or that the paving is coming up and the paving is going to be a very expensive job. So by voting to waive, you're actually voting for an assessment for these items. I'd like to see more disclosure. As much disclosure as humanly possible, right from the beginning, right from the development of the community to all the initial sales, in connection with annual budgets and in connection with resales.
I would agree with you there as well. I mean, the more disclosures, the better. The easier the job would be as well for the management side and for the board side. And that's where I believe the recommendation of the reserve study should really be across the board, because it's such a great tool to really educate not just the board of directors, but also the manager that's working at the property. You can clearly understand what are the challenges, the potential challenges, or in some cases, you may be in a great position financially where okay, we've been doing a great job here, and we could do what we need to do. However, I recently attended a webinar for one of the organizations that specialize in reserve studies. And they gave some clear examples of, other states that that have reserves. And you're surprised. I was so surprised to hear that Florida is one of the only states that allows for reserves to be waived. In most states, you're finding that close to 50, and I think it was 50% and above, are funded properly for their reserves. In Florida, you had less than 20% of the communities that were properly funded on the data that they had from the reserve studies they've done. So it really goes to show how unprepared we are as a state, as a whole state, when it comes to reserves. So the more disclosures there are, the clearer it can be to someone that's going to purchase or someone that lives within the community. Because if you don't know what the situation is, and then all of a sudden you get into a fixed income where you start, okay, that's it, I'm on a fixed income, I can't do anything. If they knew beforehand, then maybe they could have made a decision, well, I may need to make a move, or this is not the right place for me to live in. But right now, not having a reserve study, not understanding how much you need to put away for those associations that don't, it becomes very difficult for anyone to manage that situation.
I was surprised that Florida was behind the wheel when it comes to reserve studies and reserve funding. Through our research on the National Task Force, we found that 9 states require the associations to have reserve studies and require them to be periodically updated. Every state a little bit different. In 5 states, California, Delaware, Nevada, and Oregon, the reserve studies are required to be prepared by the developer and transmitted to the association upon transition. In Oregon, Oregon, the declarant has to conduct an initial reserve study and prepare an initial maintenance plan that's delivered to the homeowner leaders upon turnover or transition. So I thought it was odd. I thought Florida was the most regulated. I guess I was not accurate on that in that respect.
Yeah, no, I was completely surprised with the data. I mean, the data speaks for itself. And hopefully, these in these unfortunate situations is where we have to take it upon ourselves to do what's right, to really recognize those individuals that lost their lives. And now there's so much information out there that we have to really use this information to better our profession, to better what we're doing as a state, because if we don't, then the tragedy occurred and we didn't do what was right as human beings for those individuals that lost their lives.
Well, you know better than I that a reserve study means nothing unless the maintenance is performed on an ongoing basis. Yeah. You have a roof that has a remaining useful life of 10 years. You may not get 10 years unless you perform the maintenance that's required on an annual basis. Same thing is true with your elevators or your pavement or any of your major components. You have to have knowledge as to what is necessary to prolong the longevity of those components so that you can actually realize the remaining useful life that you're supposed to be able to enjoy.
Correct. And in most cases, as you stated, in some cases, you do good maintenance and you can actually extend the life a bit for most products. If you don't do the proper maintenance, you may find yourself in a totally different situation. And, most associations, if you were to analyze the cost of it, you'll realize that doing preventative maintenance, even though it costs you a little bit more, in the long haul, it's going to be it's a much more effective way to manage the community.
Oh, I mean, there are estimates that failing to do the ongoing preventative maintenance can cost you 10 times more when you have to do the corrective work later.
Yeah.
10 times. That's a lot of money.
That's a lot of money, especially when you're talking about all the components that you have within these condos. So the next recommendation we have, which is the one that I think we're probably going to get the Q&A going really quick, is the reserve funding. So I'm going to go ahead and read this one because this it's very important. It basically says, as to deferred maintenance and repair and replacement of components listed in the section, the task force recommends that by December 31st, 2026, an association be required to establish a fund for each component in the amount equal to not less than 50% of the replacement cost based on the remaining useful life of that component. And they go into the details of the breakdown, the 30 and 40 year useful life. But what this means in general terms is that most associations, again, if these recommendations are passed into law, we're just talking about recommendations, that associations are going to need to have 50% of whatever the reserve study states in reserves by 2026, December 31st. What are your thoughts on this, Lisa? I know that for those communities that don't have reserves, again, not all communities don't have reserves. There are a significant amount of communities that are properly funded. But for those that are barely have anything, or those that don't have anything, this is going to be some serious work that's going to need to be done. It's going to be a challenge for many. What are your thoughts on that recommendation?
Well, I mean, the Florida Bar did contemplate some alternatives, and it said if you don't have 50% actually funded by the deadline, you have to secure some alternative funding mechanism or alternative funding technique. So the only alternative funding techniques that of which we're aware, which are already in use, are levying a special assessment. That's an alternative way to fund a project, or obtaining a loan to fund the project. So what this says to me is that the Florida Bar contemplates associations having lines of credit or other funding available when those needs arise, if they haven't collected enough money to be the 50%, to meet the 50% threshold. Here's how I feel. It's not a one size fits all proposition. I mean, there are some communities out there where you have the reserve study, you have it updated constantly, people are aware of it, and they're more than happy to fund the $1 million roofing project, or you have the 16 roofs in that building, each roof would, $30,000 a piece. They're more than happy to, and they have the ability to go ahead and do that. When you're starting from scratch, it's very difficult to get up to 50%. Think about all the communities, though, that don't have owners that say, okay, it's $10,000, I'll bring you a check in the morning, or, I'll wire it to your account tomorrow. So anything that does encourage funding, or that gives associations, gives the board member leaders and managers more ammunition to say to their members, hey, this is why we're funding and why it's so important and why we have to. I feel that is beneficial for community associations as a whole, but we still need to have that flexibility, because not one size fits all. Some associations are going to find it logistically or onerous to reach that 50% threshold. And again, that 50% threshold all goes back to the veracity or the reliability of the reserve schedule, which goes back, of course, to the reserve study. So yes, I am in favor of anything that is going to stress how important it is for all community leaders and community members to understand the true cost of ownership. That's the only way I can put it, the true cost of ownership, and that they're ready for it when the time comes.
Yeah, and I would agree with you there. It's definitely necessary. I mean, it makes it much easier for boards to do what's right for the community whenever you have the funds available. You find yourself in very difficult situations when you're a board member or when you're a manager, when you're having to figure out, how am I going to get a loan for just this one piece of equipment? And then you won't be able to get a loan again, or you have to refi to do another project. So at least requiring associations to have 50% set aside, it's definitely going to make it a little bit easier for boards to make the proper decision. The question comes is, again, this is why I made the comment a little bit earlier, how important it is for you to be able to obtain the reserve study in this coming quarter, in the first quarter of next year, or ordering it already if you can, so you can understand what position you're in as a board member or as a manager. Because if this does go into law, you want to be able to start the communication to your residents today of what this impact is going to be to your association. Things are going to get, especially for those associations that aren't properly funded, things are going to get more expensive. I don't see this being thrown to the side. We know that there was a significant shortfall in the monies that were necessary to make the repairs at Surfside. So I personally do believe that this is going to be pushed. What percentage we'll see. But again, I agree with you, Lisa, there, that it's important that associations, that they do what's right for associations in order to have the proper funds, so that they understand what the true cost is to live within a condo association. What's interesting is the next recommendation, which is the developer waiver of reserves. And what the task force recommends here is to basically allow developers to waive statutory mandated reserves from section 718.112 do 2F. What's your thoughts when it comes to that, Lisa?
Well, right now, the developer of a brand new community can waive reserves unilaterally. It doesn't
Yep.
have to have any unit owner participation during the first 2 years of the operation. This recommendation is to eliminate that unilateral waiver on the part of the developer for that first 2 years. I mean, if you think about it, the first 2 years of an operation, the reserves are not very significant. So if any time is the time to start, that's when the time is to start, when the components are new and you have time to build up that fund. So yeah, I mean, I support the recommendation that developers create a legitimate reserve schedule at the outset, even obtain a reserve study to provide to the turnover board and to fund it during those first 2 years. It doesn't say anything about the waiver post the 2 years, but the law right now says that after the 2 years, the developer needs to obtain the vote of the majority non-developer owner interest to waive. If you go back to their other recommendation, that waiver would be, you couldn't waive more than 50% funding. So if something was $100,000 at year 10, and so that would require ostensibly 10 grand a year to fund, well, 50% funding would be $5,000 a year, or $5,000 this year, $1,000 next year. You know, you'd figure out the funding in a way that you'd have 50 grand at the end of that time period, as opposed to having the 100 grand at that time period.
Correct, and I agree there. I mean, if associations, if the reserves were started from day one of the development through its life, through as long as the developer owns it, it's much easier for people to understand what the true cost. I'm sure you've experienced it, that we have experienced it, where budgets that we receive from a developer turnover aren't budgets that are necessarily 100% accurate. Now, that's not to say all developers, but in most situations, they're not 100, they're not on point. They're, it's not a true cost of what it is to manage a community. So if reserves were in place from day one, again, and you're increasing your budgets as you should. I mean, we have CPI now at 6%, but if you're increasing your budgets annually, once a community is 20, 30 years old, you're not having these conversations of major special assessments. You may have one because something happens, but you're talking about, okay, we have the funds that are necessary to do the roofs, to do the cooling towers, to do all the major components within the community, and to continue to maintain the community the way it is. And that way, if individuals that live there are 55 and older on fixed incomes, they know what the true cost is to live within the community. They don't have to worry about it because they have already planned accordingly and understand that this is what I'm moving into. This is what the true cost is. And it avoids that political situation that managers and board members and everyone alike are finding themselves in these communities that didn't properly plan, or fell into the trap of, well, I'm not going to be around, so I shouldn't have to put that money in away. Well, you did live there for 10 years and you used those pieces of equipment. So you should be putting something away for it.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I mean,
Yeah.
it's fundamental fairness. People are paying for the components the time that they enjoy them. So you live somewhere for 10 years, you put away $0 towards the roof. I mean, you've basically enjoyed the function of that roof for 10 years without contributing to its depreciation.
Correct. And that's what people need to understand, that when you move into a condo, that's the situation of what you're moving into.
Plus your value is much higher. I mean, a well-capitalized building is going to have a far higher value. Now, again, if we're talking about some of our senior communities, they might not care about the residual value of the units, but it would put the community as a whole in a far better position if that schedule of known repairs was made known and adhered to, so that you're not constantly patching or robbing Peter to pay Paul when one repair comes after the next.
Correct. And the next recommendation that they're making here, it has to do with the association waiver of reserves. So again, this is one that goes to, first they talked about the developer, now they're talking about the association. So what they're saying here in this recommendation, it's basically that you're going to need the approval of no less than 70%, 75% of the voting interest present at a present and voting at a meeting in which a quorum is present. And basically, you need 75% to be able to waive it, and you cannot waive it less than 50%. So it needs to stay at that 50% mark. And again,
Okay, and let's go back saying none of this is in effect right now.
Yes.
So these are all just recommendations that are
Yes.
being vetted by our elected representatives. But yes, that's exactly right. They're increasing the voting threshold. So it's not just a majority of the quorum participating. It's 75% of the quorum participating. I don't know if that's going to be so significant or very difficult to overcome, but the 50% funding is something that is definitely needs to be planned for and need to be cognizant of. Or you can also secure that alternative funding mechanism. But what's that alternative funding mechanism? The special assessment or financing. Most associations can easily qualify for financing, so that's not necessarily a huge impediment to accomplishing your purposes. But then you're paying in the future for something that happened in the past, as opposed to paying now for something that you want to fund, yourself. And then once you get the work done, you're not paying for it anymore. The work is already done. You're paying for other things moving forward. So you always want to be on top or even with your building, let's just say that, or your improvements. That's how I feel.
Correct. No, and you're completely right there. I mean, the 75%, in my opinion, I wish it wasn't just on quorum. Maybe it went like 75% of the owners. And I know I'm probably going to catch some heat for saying that, but it's just the truth, because you can get a building that has a quorum requirement of 51%. The building's only 70 units, 75% of them. It's a fractional amount of people that can waive it down to 50%. Again, if in condo associations and associations, if you have the funds there, there's so much more. Remember, this is 50%. So that means you're still 50% short of what you should have. So if you're finding yourself in that situation, you're going to have to obtain a loan or do a special assessment. So I think, in my opinion, I wish it was a little bit more challenging to vote it down, because again, in the smaller buildings, they can probably hit that 75% fairly easy. However, again, as Lisa said, this is a recommendation. It hasn't gone into law. But again, for those managers and board members, you need to start really wrapping your head around this, of what the impact is, potential impact, I should say, is going to be for your communities, because we're looking at about 5 years that you would be in that position, or be able to have the financing available to do that, which either way, to have financing for 50% of whatever your special assessment is, there is going to be an increase in your association's budget. So you have to keep that in mind.
And our elected representatives, nobody wants to displace anybody. Nobody wants anybody to be forced out of their homes because of the cost. This is a really, really sad story. One of the senators told me when I was in Tallahassee recently, was that one of his constituents lived in one of the buildings that's been shuttered down. I think it was Crestview Towers. And the constituent said to him, listen, I've lived here for over 20 years. I paid my mortgage. I paid my maintenance. I don't even have a mortgage anymore. And now we can't even live in our property because it's unsafe. I thought I did the right thing the entire time. What I would like to say to that person and to everyone that's participating today is that you don't want your daughter or your son or anyone else to be in that position 20 years from now. What you want them to know is what they're doing now is going to save them. 20 years from now, they're going to be in the same position that they thought they were in, as opposed to this person, this constituent who basically doesn't have a home, but he's paid 100% for it already.
Correct. No, that's a good story to really relay the message, because the more disclosures, which is what they were providing earlier, that, same as some board members don't know what they're doing because they're new to the position. They're, whatever they may be, whatever position they may work during the day, they don't know what it takes to manage a building. So having a reserve study, communicating that to your residents, then everyone understands and is aware of what's going on with the way it's done now. Again, depending on your board, depending on many factors, but in most cases, that's not communicated to the residents. What's communicated is, hey, let's waive reserves. It's not, costs are going to go up. And now you have someone like that has an apartment paid
Right.
off and doesn't have an ability to even fix it on their own. You know, they're in a tough predicament. And again, that has to do because lack of communication, lack of funds in the association bank account to do what's necessary.
Right.
Um, and the last one that we have here, which again, this was a very dense recommendation, is the use of reserves. So what they're recommending is the task force recommends that mandatory reserves not be used for non-scheduled purposes other than the casualty reconstruction, including deductibles. They will allow the use for insurance premiums as long as it's paid back within 12 months. Both exceptions do require the approval of the majority of the voting interest present and voting at a meeting which a quorum is present. So I think that one, I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. I think if you could use it for insurance and you pay back in 12 months, you save yourself on that interest from the
Mhm.
financing company. I think that's a good recommendation. Anything you may want to add to it?
Yeah, anything, I mean, again, we're talking about the straight, I mean, according to the recommendations, it would be the straight lines, but anything that gives the association less discretion, you know, that also provides some support for the board, some support for the managers when they say, hey, you have $500,000 in the bank, you know, why are you making us pay for, I don't know, new tennis court, or, you know, increase, our insurance went up by 50 grand. Why, you know, why should we pay for it? We have all this money in the bank. That gives them the support to say, hey, listen, no, that money is dedicated to a specific purpose. And if this recommendation comes to fruition, then yes, that money will be available with owner consent for a casualty repair, something that's immediate that needs to be fixed right now, or just to borrow it basically for the insurance premiums, but it's paid back within the year. So anything that restricts it to increases the restrictions on the use of the funds is probably beneficial for our community associations. But again, that percentage funded or amount funded is not necessarily a one size fits all. So associations do need flexibility to account for their particular needs. You know, really, what imposing this as a layer on buildings that are already 30 and 40 years old that, you know, don't have anything in the bank, that's a huge imposition. I mean, and that's a huge adjustment. So there may need to be different considerations depending on the type of construction and the wherewithal of the actual property itself. But giving the associations flexibility to utilize those funds for non-structural related or life-saving related components is probably beneficial. I think it's beneficial.
Yeah, excellent. All right, so we touched on the two recommendations out of the 13. Again, there were 13 recommendations. We do have a significant amount of questions. I want to give us a good maybe 10, 15 minutes to go through these questions. So I'll touch up here on the first one from Thomas. And basically Thomas asked the reserve study, what do you mean in terms of years between studies? So in most cases, a reserve study, normally you'll do a reserve study. And once you do the reserve study, you can update that, let's say 18, 24 months, depending on the they'll tell you what your recommendation would be. So again, the cost is not the same as doing the initial reserve study as well. So normally the first reserve study is the one that's going to cost you a little bit more. And in my experience, really what the cost of reserve study is, it's peanuts compared to anything that you need to do within your community. So again, I want to recommend that you do that. And if you're not sure if you have a reserve study, make sure you talk to your manager, because if to order a brand new one may not make sense. If you're using someone that's a specialist in reserve studies, then you could just maybe request a update and get that updated. And that way the cost is going to be much less. I have a question here, which I'll relay to you, Lisa. It's from Jane. She says, my understanding is that reserve analysts are not licensed and the estimated life and estimated cost can vary greatly. Is the task force requiring any licensing?
From the Florida bar, they recommended that the person conducting the reserve study either be a licensed engineer or a licensed contractor with more than 10 years of experience in cost estimating. For my experience working with professional reserve analysts and reserve specialists that have been accredited in those fields, that you won't see as much of a disparity as you may see in in other types of professions. But again, I mean, everything is a little bit subjective. So the cost estimating is done according to computer programs and algorithms that are either nationalized or localized, depending on the type of service that's being performed. But estimating the remaining useful life, again, there are plenty of books out there and there are plenty of maintenance manuals out there that tell you it, but you are going to have a little bit of a disparity because it's opinion based, just like engineering reports are opinion based, just like your legal advice is opinion based, and just like even your accounting assistance is somewhat opinion based. You're going to have some variations, and that's why it's important for you to trust and to be able to rely upon any of the professionals that you work with in connection with the community association operations, because you are going to have those disparities, and you want to have the comfort to know that the advice that you are relying upon is sage advice.
Correct. And that's a good point that you bring up, Lisa, because many times, there's certain parts within the reserve study, they are estimates. They're not, there's different costs that get, that increase when there's higher demand, costs go up. But having a reserve study and someone that's specialized in it, they'll fall within a better range. And also, again, this is not an excuse to not use it. Oh, well, the cost is not precise. Well, you need to understand what the potential cost would be. And the only way of doing that is hiring a specialist, because trying to have the manager do it or guesstimate what it was is definitely not the right way of doing that. James asked here, why are windows not included in the required items?
No, windows aren't included in the turnover transition report that's prepared by the developer, but windows, if the association bears responsibility for windows, you know that they have to cost more than $10,000 at the end to replace at the end of the useful life, and all windows have life expectancies. So technically, the way that our statutes are now, you should have a line item for windows, or at least a line item for building facade, because that's going to cost more than $10,000.
Right. Yeah, I would agree there.
Sometimes the owners are responsible for maintenance of
Correct.
Windows, though, so that's a case-by-case basis.
A case-by-case basis, exactly. Lisa, I forgot to ask you earlier, if this goes into law, let's say it all goes into law, is this going to apply for every association, or do they have to have Kaufman language within the document? How do you think that that's going to play out, especially, let's say, the requirement of the reserves of the 50%?
Well, it's a very good question. For Kaufman language, for those that are not maybe that familiar with that term, Kaufman language basically is something that's either in your declaration, your articles, or your bylaws that says that the operation of your community is subject to the law as it changes over time. So some changes to the law are going to affect every community association, regardless of whether or not they have that language. Other changes to the law are only going to take effect to those communities that were not stuck in time in a particular statute. They weren't stuck in the 1984 statute and the 1986 statute. Most of these issues will likely, and again, I don't really anticipate this for the 2022 legislative session. I just think it's a little bit too raw, a little bit too new. I think our elected representatives need to ponder and evaluate really where Floridians' needs are before they start developing laws specifically on this. But I would venture to say that for reserve funding in the statute is already overrules your statutory requirements for actual budgeting itself. So if your budgeting in your governing document says that you can't go over 10% for this or over 5% for that, you're still, as a condo or a co-op right now, required to have that reserve study, required to adopt the budget with the full funding, and then it's permissible whether or not you ask the members to waive it. I would venture to say that this issue would be included in the statute as something of great public importance, and therefore intended to be applicable to all community associations, all condo and cooperative associations.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense, especially after all the work that's being put into it. At the end of the day, what they're trying to do is really protect the lives. As you stated, I'm sure this is a lot for them to take on, especially when you're getting closer to election years and so forth, where you're potentially, in certain cases, for those associations that don't have funds, getting into potentially costs going up. But ultimately, what their duty is to make sure they're protecting, the lives of the residents within the state. So being prepared and knowing as board members, again, for those that are here, it's important to know what's coming, what potentially is coming. I have here from John. John asked, do unit owners need to vote to switch from straight line to pooled reserves?
Well, that want me to answer. So in order to convert, or in order to take the money from the straight line reserves and put it into the pool, you'd have to have the members vote to authorize that. But that does not prevent the board of directors from starting a pooled reserve on day one. So if you want to start pooling your reserves 2022, the straight line funds will still be taken into account in determining what your current funding needs are, but that money will not be in the pool. So that money will only be available for the straight line items unless the members vote to take the straight line money and put it into the pool.
Correct. Yeah. And one point I want to mention, especially for those that haven't passed the reserves, is, or even for next year, if you don't have reserves, or if you have partially funded reserves, you don't have to give, as a board, you don't have to give the option to the members to waive it. A lot of people believe that they have to give that option. That is a board decision. If you decide that you want to propose a budget and you don't want to give the options to waive it, then you don't have to. Now, there is a law that states, I've never seen it happen, that, within X amount of days, if 10% of the residents they can provide a budget to the association, and then there's a meeting that must be held. But in my years, I've never seen that actually occur by the owners. So if you're in a position where you decide as a board, okay, we're going to start funding X amount of dollars, that's an option that you have as a board. So again, for those board members and managers, you don't have to give the option to waive the reserves. I have here from Thomas. Thomas asked, can a board access reserve funding without an owner vote to permit use of funds?
Well, the reserves are restricted, whether they're in the pool or whether they're straight line. The use is restricted for the purposes for which they were collected. So a board, if it's a pooled reserve, the money can be utilized by the board, doesn't require membership vote, for any legitimate reserve expenditure. Same thing with a straight line. Any money in a straight line account can be utilized by the association through its board for any legitimate reserve expenditure that falls within that category. But no, the board does not have the authority to take money out of reserves and just use it for operating purposes. That would require a unit owner vote.
Correct.
Hey, Raphael, if you don't mind, there was one
Yeah.
question here. I don't know if you're going to get to it or not, but a maintenance manual. And the question was, is that something that we make ourselves? Now, the recommendation for the Florida Bar, and it's also for CAI, is to have the developers in new communities give the transition or the turnover community leaders a maintenance manual or something that defines the components and gives you the guidelines for maintenance of those components. But that doesn't exist right now. That doesn't preclude you. You can hire appropriate professionals to provide you with maintenance guidelines for pretty much any of your components or all of your components. So many of my clients hire elevator consultants when they're going to revamp their engineers or change companies for maintenance purposes. And those consultants will tell you, here are the milestones, here are the things that need to be done, here's when they need to be done. Same thing with cooling towers, same thing with roofs. Many of the roofing contractors out there have maintenance programs or will develop maintenance guidelines for you. So if you're starting with nothing, you might want to think about what your most important components are, but that's something that I would encourage people to do, because nobody nobody, unless you're in the construction industry or an engineer or some kind of design professional, is going to innately have the knowledge of what milestones there are for cooling towers, or what maintenance tasks need to be done on a weekly, monthly, yearly basis, 5-year basis, in order to prolong the longevity of those improvements.
Correct. And as we stated earlier, that's a great point, Lisa. I mean, if we stated, it'll make everyone's life much easier if that does get passed, that the developer provides it. Because again, if you don't have it, as Lisa mentioned, just make sure that if you're working with an industry expert, they will give you some basic guidelines of, okay, this is what you should be doing. Your chief engineer, your head of maintenance, what they should be doing for the cooling tower, your elevator company, and so forth. This is what you should be doing. So it's just making sure that you're relying on the vendors that you're working with, your managers, giving them ample time to be able to work with their providers to put these schedules together. I believe where we're headed as a profession, I guess from the management side, is, again, we've always been very proactive with maintenance, but I think that moving forward, you're going to start to see that the importance of the preventative maintenance much more, especially with the changes that we can expect. Any question here that you'd like to go through, Lisa? Let me see if we have one.
There's
here.
so many.
Yeah. So I'll answer William here. William, we will be sending this video to all the participants. I'll make sure that my team also sends the task force report so that you can have copies of it and share that with your board members or manager. I have a question here from Cynthia. Is painting considered waterproofing? Well, waterproofing and painting are normally two different things. There is some paint that has some waterproofing within it. That question is probably going to be better posed to the engineer. But normally, if your question has to lean a little bit more towards the reserve study, anytime you do a reserve study, they do include the painting. If what the Florida task force is recommending is that waterproof be added as one of the mandatory items. I have a question here from Claudette. If you could please define pooled reserves. You want to take that, Lisa?
Sure, you can add, a straight line funding means that you're putting money into an account. It doesn't mean that they're separate accounts. It just means that they're accounted for separately, a specific amount of money for a specific component. So we talked about roof earlier. If your roof is going to cost $100 grand at the end of 10 years, you'd be putting $10,000 a year full funding into that line item. That $10,000 year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4 would only be available for legitimate roof reserve expenditures. In a pooled reserve, you take all of your components, whether it's roofing, paving, painting, elevators, seawall, expansion joints, cooling towers, HVAC. It's all in one big lump sum, and you're still funding it. You're still calculating what you need to contribute based upon the remaining useful life of each one of those components. But the money, the actual physical money that's in there, is available for use for any of the legitimate expenditures for anything that's in that pool. So it gives you more flexibility. You don't have $10,000 in roof reserves. You have $100,000, and it's available for any of the items that are on your reserve list.
Correct. And to add to that, that's why we mentioned earlier, we both made the recommendation that it's better to keep them in pooled, because let's just say you had the cooling tower painting and roofing on there, and for some reason your cooling tower went down earlier, you're able to use the funds if they're in pooled for the cooling tower. Now they are restricted to the items that are there, but you could use one for the other. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility when you're a board member. And to answer someone had a question here, do you have to take a vote? No, if they're pooled, you don't have to take a vote as long as you're using them for the items that are outlined within there. I have a question here from Leah. Leah, you ask if the recommendations are only for 3 stories or higher. Yes, at the moment, that's what the recommendations are. We do hope that they remove that, because there are many garden style condominium associations throughout the state of Florida that are large in size with many components But yes, the recommendations at the moment, they're stating it for buildings that are 3 stories and above, or above 3
Hey,
stories.
Raphael, if I could, Nancy asked a great question, but how does a condo buyer understand if the condo is underfunding the reserves? You're going to see this, you as community leaders and community managers that are out there, all the CAMs that are participating today. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, they've already published their new lender questionnaires. They're going to be asking a lot more questions about whether you've had any engineering reports done, whether you're collecting reserves. You know, they're going to require that you be able to show in your budget that there's money going towards reserves. And they're going to ask you a lot more questions about what work has been done, what work needs to be done at the community. For buyers, all of these records are available to the seller, to the person from which you're buying it from. So buyers may not have the independent right for their agents to call up the management office and say, I want this, I want that, I want the other thing. But if they're concerned, and this is a huge expenditure for most people, they're concerned about the value of the purchase, then they can do some of that research by asking the buyer, give me the last years worth of meeting minutes or last 5 years worth of meeting minutes. Ask them if there's a reserve study on file. Ask them if there's been any engineering reports or major work that was done over the last 5 years. And you can conduct some of that due diligence on your own before engaging in a transaction or going forward with an actual closing.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up, Lisa, because I know I had spoken to my team that handles the estoppels and questionnaires prior to the webinar, and they have seen an uptick in specific questions. We've even seen if some people have even asked, which we normally don't get asked that, do they have a reserve study on file? So we are definitely going to see a change. And also for those that don't know, for the newer board members, FHA always has a requirement that you have a 10%. That's what they look for. So, you know, if you don't have any reserves, again, the marketability of your unit is going to be less because there is a ton of people that use FHA loans. So obviously depending on the product size, on the product value, but either way, again, having some sort of reserves is better than none. But from the recommendations we are looking at, it's going to be about 50% minimum that you're going to have.
And that will satisfy any lender. I mean, lenders will be very happy.
Oh, they'll be very happy. Yeah, of course, they're going to be in a much better position. So I want to be respectful of your time, Lisa. I do see we have several other questions, but some of them aren't so much related to the recommendations themselves. Is there anything that you would like to close on the webinar with, or any recommendations that you have for both our managers and board members?
Well, I want to thank everybody for participating, because obviously you care about if it's your profession as a community association manager, or your community, if you're a community association leader, you can't be underprepared. Let's put it that way. A failure to plan is a plan to fail. Isn't that the way that the expression goes? So whatever you can do I've recommended this for years. I don't know if any of my clients have actually even taken me up on it because I haven't been involved in it, but like mini audits, an inventory of all the records that you have, especially when you're changing management. You know, you want to do this baseline inventory and take a look at all of your maintenance contracts. You know, what do they include? What don't they include? When do they expire? Is it worthwhile to hire a consultant to evaluate whether the maintenance contract is adequate for your needs? You know, is it worthwhile to hire a consultant to give you better maintenance guidelines or recommendations so that you know that your improvements are going to last as long as you want them? And definitely, if you have never done a reserve study, I really would encourage you to talk to some of the reserve professionals out there and get a baseline reserve study performed so that you are in a position of knowledge when talking to your other owners and your other members.
Correct. Thank you so much, Lisa. Great recommendations there. I wanted to close up similar with thanking all the managers and board members that are on the webinar. It says a lot about you and your leadership of the time that you've taken out of your day to gain some additional knowledge. I do hope that within the changes that happen with the recommendation that happened, that also there's a recommendation to, which that's more for our legislators, but to have board members attend certification courses so they can understand make it required, I should say, that they attend a course so they understand what the changes and the impacts that they're going to have to their associations. I also want to recommend to our managers and our board members that, you share the report and communicate it with your board members for those managers and with your unit owners for those board members that are self-managed. Let them know of what's occurring. You don't need to be the bad guy all the time. As long as you're advising them of what's going on, residents, these are the recommendations. This is how it can potentially impact us. And let the residents, make, decide of what hey, look, this is what a situation we're in. You may find that you may get support. Now, listen, with everything that's occurred, I think that this is the right thing to do. Don't wait till this comes into law to take action. Start taking action now on the recommendations. Even if certain things fall apart, it's going to benefit you and your community by getting a reserve study, understanding where you are and where you need to be in the future. Making sure you make that call. If you haven't done so yet, if you're a manager, if you're a self-managed community, contact the reserve specialists. I'm sure Lisa and I are glad to share recommendations. We will recommend 2 to 3 firms. And then that way you could already start getting proposals and make a decision. Just make sure you're working with someone that, as Lisa and I have stated multiple times, that have licensure in doing reserve study or being a reserve specialist. Thank you all again for attending. I wanted to thank Lisa's team that has worked behind the scenes to make this happen. I wanted to thank my team that made this happen. We hope that you enjoyed today's webinar. And again, these were only 2 of the 13 recommendations. So make sure you take the time to read it. And we're here for you. If you would like for us to have another webinar, don't hesitate to reach out to us. I'm sure Lisa would be glad to, I hope, join me again and provide you some more information. Thank you all, and I wish you all a happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Lisa.